Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist. Learn languages, make a difference. Today we're here to present the book, Understanding the Jihadist Terrorism in Spain, the ideology behind the metaphors. This book was recently published and it belongs to the series of critical terrorism studies. And therefore, there's not a better person to present this book than Richard Jackson, who is Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago, New Zealand. He has published numerous books and papers on critical terrorism studies, war, political violence, pacifism, nonviolent resistance, and conflict resolution. He is the editor-in-chief of the journal Critical Studies on Terrorism and the series editor, as I said, of the Routledge Critical Terrorism Studies book series. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on your show.
Thank you. So yes, I'm happy to answer any questions concerning this book to help the audience figure out what it is about.
Yeah, great. Well, look, I'm very happy to have your book in the series. I think it follows very well with a lot of other critical books that we've published. So, I mean, just to begin with, how did you come across critical terrorism studies? And yeah, what's your sort of intellectual journey into that, and how do you think that it informed your book?
Right. So my background is in philosophy. So I was always very keen on critical thinking and applying it to contemporary realities. When I did my PhD at New York University, I remember vividly that day, like it was yesterday. I was in the library and I was searching on Google something like terrorism and critical thinking, semantics, something along those lines. And then I came across the Routledge Handbook of Critical Terrorism Studies, edited by yourself. And that's when something clicked in. I think during the PhD, everybody has one or two epiphanies, and that was definitely mine. The fact that all of these intuitions that I had about terrorism not being as simple as I had seen in the mass press came together, systematized, analyzed in systematic fashion in this book from 9/11 onwards in particular. And so I began to put together the pieces of the puzzle that I had somehow intuitively in my head. So it was a very interesting moment that allowed me to decide that this was the framework I was going to use for my PhD thesis, Critical Terrorism Studies, and that I needed to be in contact with CTS scholars across the world to enhance my understanding of the phenomenon I was dealing with in the thesis.
So the book is based on your PhD thesis. Can you tell us just briefly what it's about and what the main argument is, and how you think that it makes a contribution to critical terrorism studies, for example?
Great. So yes, the book is based on the PhD thesis as much as some films are based on real facts. But from the facts to the films, or from the thesis to the book, it goes a long, long way, right? So essentially, the PhD thesis was much longer. It's a different genre, right? So because it's a different genre, you have to use different conventions. And so the PhD thesis, as I said, was much longer. There was extensive literature review that is not necessary in a book of the sort I have just published. And so the first chapter, the introduction, which is much shorter than the original one in the PhD thesis. I have also omitted a chapter on psycholinguistic evidence as to how thinking and writing along the lines of a specific language influences our perception of reality, which is also important to discuss the impact of propaganda apropos terrorism in different languages. That has been omitted. I also had an extensive introduction on the notion of Al-Andalus that I didn't include in the chapter. So it's much more focused on my corpus analysis, which is original, right? So it's much more focused on the empirical part. And the theoretical part is restricted to chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1 is mostly about my contribution to CTS, which I will now address, answering your question. And then the second one is about the Spanish transition to democracy. Those are the two theoretical chapters, and after that is all corpus analysis plus the conclusion. By the way, the conclusion is available open access, so everybody can read it for free in the link that I will put below in the description box. And now let us address the innovations concerning CTS. I would say that the book introduces two innovations. The first one is digital corpus analysis. For the purpose of my analysis, which I call critical metaphor analysis, is a critical thinking study of the metaphors used for propagandistic purposes apropos the Madrid and Barcelona attacks. I use the software Buoyant Tools, which is open access, available for free. Anybody can access it. Just Google Buoyant Tools and you will find it. And Buoyant Tools allows me to use a very extensive corpus. I think the Madrid one was around 100,000 words, and the Barcelona is slightly shorter. And then it allows you to see word clouds, correlations, collocations. For instance, in the case of this book, it was very important to me to see the correlations between terrorism and democracy, because I argued that these two are mutually reinforced discursively. So with what frequency does terrorism appear, and does it mirror the appearance of democracy? Is it the case that every time democracy is mentioned, also terrorism is alluded to, etc.? So this type of digital discourse analysis was innovative in that I'm not aware of any other use of Buoyant Tools for the analysis of critical terrorism materials. And the second innovation is probably the multilingualism of the book. I did have to change a lot of things from the PhD thesis, in the sense that the PhD thesis contained the original quotes first and then the translation into English, since I wrote it at a Spanish department. This was not the case. It's intended for an English-speaking audience first, so the quotes are always in English first, and then if there is a substantial difference vis-a-vis the original quote, then I will include the original quote as well. So it contains a lot of material in Spanish, a little bit in Catalan, and also a little bit in Arabic. And I think that multilingualism is a nice addition to critical terrorism studies, which traditionally, perhaps not anymore, but traditionally has been primarily focused on the UK and the US, perhaps.
Okay, look, I'm going to depart a little bit from the questions that we had organized here, but could you just perhaps give us a little bit of a taste of the kind of argument that you're making in this book?
Yes.
So one of the key statements that comes at the very beginning, but I think it's the argument that you're making throughout the book, is that in Spain, democracy doesn't function despite terrorism, but sometimes it functions through terrorism. What do you mean by that, and how do you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, so this is an insight, again, that I had access to as part of my reading of the Routledge Handbook of Critical Terrorism Studies. There's not my original insight, but applying it to Spain was perhaps my original contribution. And so this is to say that I believe that terrorism takes place despite democracy and in conjunction or in tandem with democracy everywhere, but in particular about Spain, because the book is about Spain, right? So yes, as you said, the thesis is that in Spain, democracy, or so-called democracy, has consolidated itself not only despite factual, violent political attacks, but also thanks to those attacks, whether those are in the form of state terrorism or in the form of exploiting propagandistically otherwise actual violent political attacks. So I think one of the key ideas, and it's hard to explain it and sometimes controversial, is that something can be factual and at the same time propagandistically exploited.
Very interesting. I mean, you also relate this to what's called the transition problem in Spain, and this is to do with I think the field of Iberian studies, if I'm correct. So what's this problem, and what's the role of terrorism as you've analyzed it?
Yes, the problem in Spain and also in Portugal, but the book focuses on Spain, is that the narrative, whether it is from a conservative lens or from a liberal one, is always being that, again, the Spanish so-called democracy consolidated itself despite terrorist attacks that play the role of the external threat, overcoming which will result in consolidating democracy for everybody. And so where I introduce a critical perspective is in saying, look, what if democracy always already necessitated terrorism to define itself by opposition? So that even when there were no violent political attacks against the state itself fabricated the possibility of those attacks to derive legitimacy by contradistinction. And so in Spain, we have a long history of that during Francoism and afterwards. Right? So during Francoism, we have, for instance, ETA. Afterwards, also ETA. But then we have the introduction of so-called jihadist terrorism. And so-called jihadist terrorism, regardless of actual violent political attacks, fulfills a political function, which is that of taking over the role from ETA. That means the role of a sub-state violence by opposition to which the state claims legitimacy and claims to be the best possible representative of the nation's democracy.
That's so interesting. One of the arguments that you make, I believe, is that that Spain, this case is a little bit different. Like the Spain case is a bit different from the UK or the US in this regard. But I mean, it seems to me that you could make the case that in the UK or in the US, terrorism has played a similar kind of role. But are you disputing that? Are you trying to make a different kind of argument to that?
Yeah, I think I will say that I'm nuancing that rather than disputing it. So in the book, I argued that the way in which terrorism is discursively framed in Spain has to do with the convergence of two major narratives, the war on terror and the Spanish transition to democracy. And so the war on terror is a narrative from the US imported into Spain because Spain had been allies with the US and the UK concerning the invasion of Iraq. And to that, one has to add the specificities of the Spanish transition to democracy. So who is disputing democracy in Spain, in addition to factual or made-up terrorists? That is the question. And that question can only be answered in terms that are unique to Spain. So we can talk about Catalan independence. We can talk about the Basque unique take. We can talk about democracy fundamentalists like Antonio García Trevijano, who did not agree with violence, but did not agree with the way in which so-called democracy was implemented in Spain. And so you have a number of actors that oppose democracy as it has been portrayed discursively and consolidated in Spain, that evolve over the years. Some of them are silenced, marginalized, and then emerged again after a decade or two, like it happened, for instance, in Spain after the Indignados movement, when a lot of the narratives against the way in which the Spanish transition had been conducted gained more legitimacy given the economic crisis in which this transition had resulted. And again, terrorism functions as a placeholder that is now occupied by ETA, then occupied by Al-Qaeda, then by ISIS, then by Tsunami Democratic, but always has some specific content that allows the Spanish state to proclaim itself as the embodiment of democracy by opposition.
Very interesting. I mean, I think it speaks to the fact that discourse, particularly political discourse around terrorism, is always highly situated. I mean, and you do have to pay close attention to the context in which it comes out. And I think what you've done is very, very interesting because there's a very big literature obviously looking at discourse, political discourse around terrorism in the Western sphere, particularly the major powers, but also including Australia and New Zealand a little bit as well. So yeah, I think this is a really good contribution. Now, in the book, you focus specifically on two cases, the 2004 Madrid case and the 2017 Barcelona case. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about what you researched there and what the differences are between those cases and how the discourse worked?
Yes, of course. The Madrid case was a turning point because it was essentially the implementation of the 9/11 logic, both as to the attacks and the response to the attacks in Europe. So they marked a before and an after, and as such, they have been much more studied and researched than the Barcelona attacks. So they took place, the Madrid attacks, in 2004 on March 11th, when the train bombings took place in Atocha, which is a major train station in Madrid, and around 200 people were killed and thousands were injured. The attacks were, quote unquote, loosely associated with Al Qaeda, which means that the perpetrators claimed links to Al Qaeda, but they were not part of the organization per se. They were not members of Al Qaeda. Some of them had Spanish passports, some of them didn't, which already breaks down the supposed binary between we, Spanish, democratic, civilized, and they, non-Spanish, savage, Muslims, etc., which is the whole binary that is at stake in the propagandistic exploitations of these attacks and the Barcelona attacks, which, by the way, your book of Brighting the War was very instrumental in illuminating the existence of these binaries. So I thank you for that too. And now we have the Barcelona attacks, which take place in 2017, August 17th. And these are carried out by a younger group, around 10 to 15 years younger than the perpetrators loosely associated with Al Qaeda. And in this case, these are loosely associated with, again, they claim to be part of or act on behalf of, but are not members of ISIS. And Yunus Abu Yaqub, a member of the group, just drove a van into pedestrians in the iconic Boulevard of Las Ramblas in Barcelona. And the result of that was that 15 people, 16 were killed and many others were injured. This was not as mass scale attack as the Madrid one. Again, it was not the first of this sort in Spain, so it didn't have the same impact, but at the same time, it touched upon further political problems in Spain, such as the independence of Catalonia from the rest of Spain, which was and then a very hot topic. So it begged further questions as to the way the Spanish and Catalan autonomous police should or not coordinate, in between inverted commas, because this is also a very loaded word, etc. And then it was a few months before the referendum for independence on October 1st. So that's why all of these aspects made it very significant. Mm-hmm.
Right, and so I think the main things that you do in the book is you analyze how the media, in particular, depicts these events, and also the response to them. And you're quite interested in the role of metaphors. Now, can you tell us, what do metaphors do? I mean, what is their function? How are they ideological? And yeah, what kind of ideological effects did the metaphors that were used in these cases have? Can you give us, a few examples?
Yes, metaphors are absolutely fascinating. There's a quote that I include in the book, which is, the price of a metaphor is eternal vigilance. So we as researchers have to be alert always about the ways in which metaphors are used. Why? Because they are, I argue, embedded forms of ideological claims. So each metaphor that I analyze in the book contains an ideological claim which is implicit. So insofar as it is not made explicit as an argument, one cannot argue against that metaphor, which means that they are not legally binding. One cannot sue another person for using a metaphor, because the other person can always say, well, I was speaking in metaphorical terms. I didn't actually mean it literally. At the same time, they are highly replicable. Some metaphors are very catchy, and so they're used again and again and again, most of the times without a critical awareness as to what they entail ideologically. For instance, let's talk about Brexit, right? There were two major metaphors concerning Brexit. There was the Brexit as a splitting of the bill and the Brexit as a divorce. Who do you think supported the metaphor of the splitting of the bill, and who supported the metaphor of divorce, right? Obviously, the people who were in favor of Brexit said, look, this is just a splitting of the bill. What are the ideological implications that a critical researcher like me or like us needs to unpack there? That it is a rational decision, Solomonic one, here's your part, here's mine, goodbye, good to do business with you, right? However, the people who were against Brexit were framing it as a divorce. What are the implications there? That there is an emotional attachment, that there is a rupture, that there is trauma, that there are disagreements, which speaks to the identitarian links between the UK and the EU, etc., etc. So that frames it as a problem in and on itself, without the need for those who are opposing Brexit to argue, well, this is very problematic in identitarian terms because this is already embedded into the metaphor of divorce to frame Brexit. So something similar happens with the attacks. For instance, when the Madrid attacks took place, and many people may remember this, the Aznar administration rushed to say it was the responsibility of ETA. Why? Because Aznar had a record of being tough on ETA, and so he figured that if he attributes the responsibility to ETA, given that there were going to be national elections within 4 days, that will put him in a stronger position than if the attacks were associated with, say, Al-Qaeda, right? So he said, okay, it has been ETA, there's no doubt about it. He called a lot of newspapers, The Guardian, etc., saying, please tell people that this been ETA. I can guarantee for sure. They called United States, say the same, etc., right? Which was horrible, of course. And as the hours went by, people started realizing that things didn't add up, that it was not clear at all that it had been the responsibility of ETA or that ETA had anything to do whatsoever. And instead, they started to think about a connection with Al-Qaeda. And so when he offered a conference press, he was asked, well, it seems that there's no evidence of ETA involvement, and there's more and more evidence that there might be some involvement from Al-Qaeda. What do you think about this? He replied with a very interesting metaphor. He said, no me pida que juegue a las quinielas, which translates into don't ask me to play prediction brackets, we call it in the US. I think in the UK is betting pools, as in football pools, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to bet on who's going to win a match between Manchester United and Crystal Palace, right? And you say, okay, Manchester United is going to win. I don't have all the evidence with me, but it's a bet, right? So he said to the journalist, essentially, don't ask me to gamble on the responsibility of the attacks, as if that was a frivolous thing to do. And we might agree or disagree that it's a frivolous thing to do, but he didn't make the argument because he used the metaphor instead, embedding that argument into the metaphor. And it just so happens to be the case that he himself had made already that gamble by saying that it had unequivocally been the responsibility of ETA. However, because he was using a metaphor, he could not be accused of contradicting himself, because he never stated that explicitly. It is the responsibility of the researcher to unpack that.
So what about the 2017 attacks? Were there any particular metaphors that were used there that are interesting to researchers?
Yeah, there was one I can think of, which is La Vanguardia, I think, claimed that these attacks had been an aldabonazo that should wake up people to the real problems in Catalonia and Spain. So an aldabonazo is very interesting because it's a piece of metal which is made in the form of a lizard. It's an Arabic word, actually, which again has implications. And it's something that you have to grab with your hand and then release onto the door. So it's a metal release onto the booth, so it's heard knock knock, right? That's the sound that it does. So framing the attacks as that already points out to Muslims, insofar as Arabic is the language representative of the Ummah, and at the same time says it's a wake-up call as to the real problems of Spaniards and Catalans. What are those real problems? The independence of Catalonia from Spain. So that so-called terrorism, so-called jihadist terrorism, would be a distraction from the real problems. So there are massive ideological implications in just framing the attacks as an aldabonazo that should wake people up to the real problems. But the researcher needs to unpack that, especially as a linguist, right? As a critical linguist, I can say, look, this is the etymology of the word. This has rarely been used for the purpose of framing any attacks ever, but there's a very political function to this. And then at the same time, who gets to say what the real problems are? There is no justification to claim that those are the real problems as opposed to others. But
Yeah.
by claiming it without arguing for it, you're just hoping that it flies.
Yes, and that sort of connection as well to the Catalan independence movement kind of brings us back full circle to the transition problem and the question of democracy and whether terrorism functions despite, sorry, whether democracy functions despite terrorism or through terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, just as a final set of questions, you studied this, and 2017 is now somewhat in the past. Is this just a kind of a study of historical interest now, or is there still relevance to what you found, and how might it relate to contemporary events that are going on, perhaps in Spain? I'm thinking around the whole question of the genocide in Gaza and the way in which that's framed in some quarters as a counter-terrorism operation against Hamas. But Spain has taken quite a radical approach to that in some ways. I mean, does your analysis have relevance to contemporary events?
Yes, definitely. My analysis is a frame within a longer film, right? And it's just the frame of how the doctrinal idea of jihad was exploited for propagandistic purposes in connection with the binary democracy versus terrorism. And the specificities of that phenomenon are unique to that time and space coordinates, but at the same time they resonate with others. So as I said before, in the case of Spain, terrorism is just a placeholder. Might have been so-called jihadist terrorism for a few years, then it was Catalan independence and Tsunami Democratic, then it was COVID, the disruptors, and then it will be somebody else tomorrow. The problem is not so much what the identity of that somebody else is, but what is the political function of framing that perpetrator in that type of identity. When we talk about Gaza, something similar in a way it's taking place, which is there is a racialized other which is framed as terrorist by a state that defines itself as democratic / Western / civilized by opposition. So that is the common logic. And so by delving into the kind of metaphors and propaganda that is used or was used between 2004 and 2017 to frame that racialized other, one can better understand the use of metaphors in Western mass media to frame the Palestinian other. And so I think that that is where the commonality resides.
Great. Well, you're selling your book very well there. Is there something that you're currently working on that might be of interest to critical terrorism studies scholars?
Yes, I'm working on two projects. The first one came to my mind thanks to this Visa conference that we were talking about, the British International Studies Association annual conference, where I presented a paper on religious concepts that were exploited for propagandistic purposes apropos the Madrid and Barcelona attacks. And I talk about barakah and jihad and how they're both linked in the way they were used propagandistically. But there's also a third concept that Hugo Gaudino, shout outs to him, suggested to me, which is taqiyya, right? Dissimulation. And I argued that taqiyya functions as a right-wing dog whistle in that it is overrepresented in media, whereas in fact, within Islam, it's just consecrated to certain type of Islam, the Shi'i Islam, which is not the majority one. and a very specific context. Whereas in mass media now, it is used in popular media as a way in which the Muslim other can always be framed as the enemy. So if you're Muslim and you're wearing a beard, then you might be framed as radical. But if you're not wearing a beard, maybe you are just incurring taqiyya. So it's just another way to snitch on the Muslim other and frame that identity as perpetually susceptible of being framed as a threat. So the way in which those three concepts have worked in the mass media propaganda in Spain is very interesting. So I'm working on an article that I would like to submit for the Journal of Critical Terrorism Studies concerning these three notions. I think it's also interesting because these religious notions have been analyzed from the perspective of the way in which they have been discursively used by the perpetrators or people that claim connection to the perpetrators, but not the way in which they have been discursively used by mass media. And then the second project is a book project whose book proposal I plan to submit in September to Critical Terrorism Studies as well, which is about, it's called Occupy Words, Living Tongues. And it's about the social linguistics of occupation in Al-Andalus and in Palestine. So obviously, both are part of the Ummah. As the Hadith says, when one part of the Ummah suffers, the other does. And there are similarities in the sense that the Christian occupation of Granada follows a colonial/settler logic that is also common to the Zionist occupation of Palestine, or Gaza in this case, which will be more comparable to Granada. If we go into Al-Andalus Palestine, then Granada Gaza. And how inscriptions in Arabic and spaces where Arabic was part of the language landscape, as we say in social linguistics, were replaced by Castilian, which was then made Spanish as an imperial language, or Hebrew in this case, right? So what are the commonalities and discontinuities between the social linguistics of occupation in Al-Andalus and Palestine? I think that this is a very urgent topic, and it's something that I'm fascinated by, so that's what I'm working on too.
Wow, that sounds super interesting, and yeah, we look forward to seeing what you produce. It's been a real pleasure talking to you about your book, and I'm very happy that it's in the book series. Yeah, make sure to go out and get a copy. And yeah, thank you for having me on your show, and I look forward to seeing what you produce next.
Thank you very much, Richard, and I just want to conclude by saying that it is thanks to you in a great part that I have devoted my efforts in my PhD thesis and my book to unpacking these problems. And so I thank you for the inspiration and for putting together the concepts that have allowed me and other CTS scholars to think about and through these issues. Thank you very much, Richard.
Pleasure.